Okay, welcome back. I have finished all the micro chapters, so now we're going to start the macro chapters. We are on macro, chapter 12, the Keynesian perspective. The next three lectures basically are going to be about economic philosophy. So, first we will take on demand side philosophy. And John Maynard Keynes, we've touched on some of this, but now we're just going to go a little bit deeper, okay? Chapter 13, we're going to talk about supply side economics and Say's law and the philosophy of supply side. And then I have also assigned the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx because it is the third main political philosophy. And anyone who teaches you economics or politics and doesn't ask you to at least read it is doing you a disservice. So you should know what it says. I will be upfront and say that it's wrong. It's just most of communism and the Communist Manifesto is wrong, but there are some really cool quotes, and there are some really nice insights, and there are some really cool predictions that Marx and Engels make about the future of economics and the structure of the economy and the relationship between labor and the owners of the means of productions and these sorts of things. So we're going to get all three. We're going to get both of the sides of the philosophy of the free market, but we're also going to get at least a basic introduction to Karl Marx, communism, and the other side. Because even if communism as economics doesn't necessarily work, as we've seen, I would also retort that we've never really seen Marx's vision laid out in reality. They've been very warped and sort of violent visions of what Marx wrote about. So we haven't seen Marxism in reality, first of all. But Marx is also one of our most brilliant political and economic philosophers of the last 2 centuries, so it's sort of a must-read from that perspective. But also Marxism is used widely as a lens through which to see other branches of science, such as gender studies, political philosophy, things of this sort. So even if the economics of communism and Marxism are pretty much discredited by now, there are still things to be gleaned by reading the book. So don't ever think just like completely disregard something. There's always something to be learned about, right? And so that's why I assigned it. So if you want to pull out your notes, we're going to start up on chapter 12. I have provided the notes. I hope you will have read the chapter and gone through the notes as you did so, because it's really helpful. But you should also be learning something about structuring your own notes and pulling out the most important information from what you read. So hopefully it helps in that sense too. Okay, Macro Chapter 12, Keynesian Perspectives. The thesis of the chapter and of Keynesian economics is sort of hidden somewhere in section 2, so I just popped it up here at the front. Keynesian economics focuses on explaining why recessions occur and on offering policy prescriptions for minimizing their effects. So Keynesian economics was a response to the Great Depression, the severely lagging, sort of flaccid demand that existed in the market in the 1930s, despite all of America's really excellent production facilities at the time. We just didn't have any demand. So while we could produce all kinds of stuff, Say's law wasn't working, right? I mean, just producing stuff wasn't actually causing GDP to go anywhere. And so Keynes studies this phenomenon, and he writes his book, and it's about the demand side. Like, how do governments or an economy in general, given what we know about economics, how can we pick that lagging demand up to catch up with the supply or the production frontier, right? So at sometimes when economies are lagging, we need we need a new way of approaching things. And so thus comes Keynes, because just building more factories it clearly is not going to solve the problem. And that was sort of Say's approach, right? Like if you're just making stuff and you're just building more factories, it will cause demand. And for the most part, that's right. But during these recessionary periods, Say's law sort of is out the window, and we needed a new way of conceptualizing how economics works. So this graph, figure 12.2, is a tracking of GDP growth or declination over time. So don't think that this is actual GDP. This is the growth rate or the decline rate in each individual year, okay? And so there are a lot of things to be sort of gleaned from this graph. First is that the wild swings or vicissitudes of the economy have shrunk quite dramatically, right? You see incredible wild swings in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. It's starting to really even out in the 1960s and 1970s. The 1980s are a little more wild because at that point we had lowered our interest rates too low. We didn't really have a way to kickstart the economy that way. We had almost taken one of the two options away from our federal government, and so it was a little bit harder. So we're learning more about that as well. The 1990s, you can see, are really, really flat. Part of the reason for this is because we're learning more about economics. We know how to control the wild swings that economics can bring to a developing state or a state that just doesn't understand the phenomena of economics yet, which is sort of where we were, right? And we're learning more and more every day. We're nowhere near where a real biological science or something of that sort would be, or a geological science, but clearly we're learning things, right? But a lot of the stability of the 1990s also was this false external growth rate because of the dot-com boom. There was so much money flooding into the system in the 1990s. A lot of it was even fake money, like, dogfood.com's going for $100 million or whatever. And this is 1990s terms. And so just they're spending absurd amounts of money on these companies, or even just domain names. It was pretty wild. But that dropped off clearly, and then we saw the after effects of just ignoring your economy and letting things just burn brightly under the Greenspan plan. Things sort of collapsed under George Bush 1 at the beginning of his term, but then also at the end of his term, we saw the crash of 2007 and 2008. So this is the first time we've actually seen negative growth in man, what is that, 70 years or something, was in 2008. And so that's why you see that singular dip under the zero line, is we had a contraction in our economy. And that's a pretty scary thing, right? And then Obama comes in and manages to sort of flatten things out at least, and we get back on track, But that's the history sort of GDP growth over time. And so note the wild swings, note that we're learning about how it works. Note that we almost never have a shrinkage of the economy. We might have recessionary tendencies, but it's generally very, very unlikely, knowing how much we know about economics, for massive shrinkages to occur. The problem was that we deregulated the entire industry, and the banks just sort of went crazy and overextended themselves and overleveraged themselves with the housing market, which a lot of economists right now are warning is happening again. And we might touch on that at the end of the lecture. So let's move on. Section 12.1, aggregate demand in Keynesian analysis. So now that we've talked about sort of the history of how this works, we'll dig into the nitty gritty. All right. So theoretically, excuse me, let me get a sip of water. Theoretically, when aggregate demand is at its frontier, and it is pressing up against the short-run aggregate supply line, Uh, Aggregate supply just goes up, right? Because you're already on the frontier. You can't make any more product, at least in the short run. And so any increase in demand just leads to inflation, basically. At least theoretically, right? And then any decrease in demand from that production possibilities frontier curve, where we're producing efficiently, 100%. If you drop that demand, what happens is that prices stay stable. Unfortunately, but your GDP contracts. So your economy contracts, unemployment rises, but prices stay the same because prices are sticky, as we'll learn about. And so this is a real problem. And you get a glut of supply on the market, and nobody is buying things, and it causes real problems. It causes, we'll sort of talk about the chain of problems that it can cause, and I think the Great Dust Bowl is a great example. So we'll talk about that at the end. Real GDP. Let's see. Okay, so GDP contracts, as I just noted. You move from Y of P, which is sort of your possibilities curve, to Y of 1. So now your GDP is contracted, which means that your labor market is contracted, but your price levels don't actually change, which is very difficult. The components of aggregate demand, remember we talked about this really early in the textbook, are spending, consumption, basically. So the purchasing of final products in the market. Number 2 is investment spending. So this could be buildings, it could be new technology, it could be research and development, it could be a lot of things. But this is the investment side of it. You have government spending, and then you have your trade balance, or your net exports is how they refer to it. But remember, that means exports minus imports, because it's an equation, and you want to know about the net exports. So we'll talk about how you can affect all of these different things on the aggregate side, the macro side of the economy. So consumption spending, according to Keynes, is based upon disposable income. And as your disposable income increases, you're likely to spend larger proportions of your budget, of your total income, basically. That also comes to a cap, right? The super rich can only spend so much eventually, and so there will be marginal diminishing returns. Again, we're coming back to this theme. But for the most part, for the average person in an economy, as disposable income increases, so does your spending. Your expected future income. So this is expectations of the future. Does your president think that things are going well? Do you think that things are going well? Are economists talking about things are going well? Is the stock market looking good? Although that's a false indicator these days. We'll probably talk about that at the end. Maybe the end of the book, not the end of this chapter. But it's all about expectations. Do you see yourself having a growth in your salary? Does your society in general think that wages are growing? Does it think that the economy in the future is going to be healthy? And if so, you're likely to see more spending now on expectations of future wealth. Okay. And then the final one is just wealth or access to credit. As a society becomes wealthier, they tend to consume more and save less. This works cross-nationally. It works across United States. It works across cities and towns. This is pretty much a locked-in law of economics. The more people make, the more they consume. Number 2, investment spending. Again, this is going to be about expectations of future profit. It's about the expectations of the economy in general, or if I'm in a particular firm, say cattle, what is my expectations of the future price of cattle? Right now, it should probably be pretty good, considering that the world is growing, and the middle class is growing across the world, and that cattle demand for beef has increased year on year on year on year. So just in that singular market, I wouldn't even say firm, but in that singular market, there's probably really excellent expectations for future profit, and so they're probably investing in further cattle, further land, ways of ensuring that their cattle are vaccinated so that they don't catch diseases, so that they can be sold on the market, ways of genetically designing the beef so that they're bigger, all kinds of different things, right? And so these are all different ways that you can invest in your own firm, and that all the firms in your market could invest in their own market in general to increase investment spending because they have expected benefits in the future. All right, and then another one which the Fed can control is interest rates. This is also to be thought of as just the cost of borrowing, right? So interest rates is a very specific terminology, but all it really means is how much does it cost me to borrow? The cheaper it is to borrow money, the more likely you are to derive a profit off of that borrowed money. And so as interest rates drop, you're likely to see more borrowing, more investment. The third aspect of aggregate demand is government spending, and this can be accomplished a few different ways. The first is through actual government spending. During FDR's time, actually, interestingly, I live about 30 minutes from a town called New Deal, Texas. New Deal, Texas was completely built from scratch from federal government money because they were trying to figure out ways to just stimulate demand, right? Let's get people to work. Let's pay them to do literally anything, like make a street, dig a ditch, paint a building, do anything, do what you can do. It was really funny. In the chapter, they're talking about some of the quotes by Keynes and some of his sort of tongue-in-cheek jokes about how we can stimulate demand through government. And he said at one point, just build a complete replica of the pyramids in Egypt, and have the government pay people to do this, because then they'll take that money and spend it on stuff. Bury money in the ground and then pay people to dig it up. So there were some cute little jokes about it, but really it's about just like get money out there, because there's a multiplier effect, especially when you are in a depressionary or recessionary period. There's this incredible multiplier effect where each dollar is worth much more than the dollar you put in. Okay. Some other ways other than actual government spending, right? And again, that can be through research. It can be through just paying people to do stuff. It could be through infrastructure, like they're talking about under Joe Biden right now, which we've been talking about for 30 or 40 years. So I don't really know if anything's going to happen, but there are lots of ways the government can just inject money into the system. But there are also tax policies. So the government, you're not actually affecting the government spending aspect of the aggregate demand model, but the government can tangentially affect the consumption aspect. Point number one, consumption spending, by cutting taxes, by offering tax benefits or even tax write-offs and these sorts of things. So there are lots of different ways that the government can adjust things. They can do it themselves directly, or they can do it indirectly through taxation policy. Okay. I should note that most economists and Keynes himself think that the government is the only one that can do this. The government is the only entity that is big enough or grand enough or legitimate enough. I wouldn't even say or, I would say and all of these things. The government is the only entity that can actually affect aggregate demand. And maybe we're bordering on the idea that we're eventually allowing companies to become so large that they can affect aggregate demand, like Amazon or companies like this, but I doubt it. I really doubt it. Like, even Amazon is such a small portion of the United States economy that really the government is the only one, and they're the only one with the legitimacy and the ability to write laws, right? So government is necessary once you're in a recessionary or depressionary slump. The government according to Keynes and according to most neoclassical economists, you need to be stimulating the economy as much as possible. And I think that we are in that point right now. We are in no way at our production possibilities frontier curve in America, or really across the world, right, because of the COVID-19 issue. And so we're at the point where just pumping money into the system would be the answer, according to Keynes and according to neoclassical economists. The last one is the trade balance. So this is net exports. This is exports minus imports, because remember, imports, money is being flooded out of your own economy. I would note that this is really small, so this isn't really going to affect, especially like if you're just making adjustments to net exports, you're not really going to affect aggregate demand in any real sense. It's such a small portion of aggregate demand in general. So I don't know, some of the politicians were out there screaming about, protectionism, and we need to stop buying foreign. The benefits of buying foreign are really high for a middle class and the upper class. The detractors of buying foreign are really small because it's such a small portion of our economy. So with that note, you can adjust the trade balance, right? We can try to push more exports and buy fewer imports, and sort of make a small adjustment to our trade balance, maybe from negative to positive or whatever. As we discussed earlier, it's really situational as to whether negative or positive or balanced or whatever it is good or bad for your economy. So it's not as simple as just having a trade surplus is a good thing. That's not necessarily true. There are ways that governments can affect this. One is through differential growth rates. So if you consider Mexico and the Mexican and American trade relationship, if America is growing and Mexico is shrinking, we have differential growth rates, right? Americans are going to start buying more Mexican products, and Mexicans are going to buy fewer American products, just naturally. And so this is a sort of a natural occurrence from a shrinking economy and a growing economy. You generally always see a little bit of an imbalanced growth, right? You get more imports and fewer exports because they're getting poorer and you're getting richer. All right. Number two is changes in relative price. This is a touchy one. As prices change, right? And it's not even prices, it's the value of currencies, right? As my currency becomes more powerful compared to your currency, say the dollar and the yuan, because we're going to talk about this in a minute. As the dollar becomes stronger and the yuan becomes weaker, Chinese are going to buy fewer American products, and Americans are going to buy more Chinese products because our dollar is worth more. It is more powerful in the international system, basically. And so we're getting more yuans per dollar or whatever. This can be a problem because the Chinese manipulate their currency, and they've been doing it for 30 years. They understand the implications of this. They want to lead an export-driven market. South Korea is also guilty of this, though South Korea plays by the rules far, far better than China does, okay? And South Korea is an ally, so we don't scream about it as loudly, right? But this is a real problem in the system. And the World Trade Organization and many, many international laws say that this currency manipulation, you purposefully deflating the value of your currency so you can drive up exports and drive down imports, is illegal by WTO rules. Now, here is the problem. The WTO is toothless, okay? And if the WTO simply says, China, you're breaking the rules, you can't do that, here's the fine you have to pay, China will just say, too bad, we're not going to pay it. And then the WTO becomes less and less legitimate, and it becomes sort of a fantasy, I guess more of a fantasy than it is today because, like I said, it's pretty toothless. But this is one of the problems of not having an international watchdog, at least not one that has any teeth to it because America doesn't want to hold up to international trade laws. China doesn't. Russia doesn't. Brazil doesn't. South Africa doesn't. All of the major economies on Earth, basically, except for Europe, are saying, you know what, we're not going to follow these rules. And so the rules don't really exist, except between European Union countries where they have their own EU rules, and those have a lot more teeth than WTO rules. They're still not great, it's still pretty weak, but it's a lot better than the World Trade Organization on the actual international system, okay? So, all of that to say that changes in relative prices and currency can affect your trade balance, your net exports. All right. And then here's a really nice table to kind of, for you to be able to go back to and just see, okay, this is how it all works, this is how it all moves. Right? Section 12.2, the building blocks of Keynesian analysis. There are two main building blocks or two main assumptions of Keynesian analysis that neoclassicals basically all agree on. There is some argument around the margins, like how slow is slow, right? But they're pretty much locked in at this point. Keynes thinks first that aggregate demand is not automatically efficient. Okay, that's pretty simple, and I don't think it's even arguable. We clearly see depressions and recessions across the world. There is no reason why aggregate demand would be pushing up against the production possibilities frontier curve. There's no reason for it theoretically. There's no evidence for it from a data perspective. So this is basically inarguable. Number two, ramping up the economy is slow. This is where you get a little more argument around the margins. There's more to be discussed here. How slow is slow? Are all industries slow? Are there ways that the government can inject money into the system that are faster than others? So this is something we can argue about. Ramping up is slow. You can't really argue about that. There is always going to be a lag, but we can talk about how slow is slow, all right? So the quote here is that macroeconomy may adjust only slowly to shifts in aggregate demand because of sticky wages and prices, which we're about to talk about. And sticky wages and prices are those wages and prices that do not respond to decreases or increases in demand. There will always be a lag between the policy and the actual effect of the policy. It will take time. You can't just inject $100 billion into the economy and think that $100 billion is going to hit the shelves the next day, or that prices can adjust that fast, or any of these things, right? So why are wages sticky? We'll talk about first. We talked a lot about this in the unemployment chapter. So in the unemployment chapter, we talked about wages are sticky because if you start dropping wages across the board, you're just going to lose your best people. And, you know, there were about 6 or 7 of them on the board. So if you're interested, go back and review that. But wages are sticky. It takes time. It's generally called the coordination problem or the coordination argument. There's no way for all firms or the entire market to be able to coordinate wages up or down. There are also limitations, right? To be able to adjust down would mean for minimum wage people that you're paying them illegally, right? So we have a price floor. If you want to push wages up, you may have a problem in that you're going to have to readjust how we spend our money, right? We're going to have to take that money for wages from somewhere else. CEO packages, which they don't want to give up, from investment in the company, which could have a future payoff, which could mean more wages in new facilities. And, you know, there's always a give and take. And so wages are sticky. It takes a long time for them to ramp up. Or down. And then prices are also sticky there are a lot of, both theoretical and real world reasons for this. It's just hard to adjust things every day, right? The only real time priced goods that I can even think of would be stocks, or raw materials on the commodities exchange. So you're talking about cotton, the price of beef, um, a barrel of crude oil, these sorts of things which we can measure instantaneously. We trade commodities instantaneously, and they're tracked all the time. How do you change the price of a stick of gum daily or instantly, as the economy moves? You can't do that. And Walmart would say, like, we can't send our guys out every single day to change prices. It doesn't work like that. We'd have to have a million price guys or ladies, it's insane. And so there are real world reasons why you can't do this. It's too expensive. Also, you can't collect that much data and analyze it that fast, right? Like if we haven't even gotten the data from yesterday's sales, how can we change today's prices, right? And so that takes time. There are a lot of, they're just called menu costs, right? These are the costs where it's just, not only is it overly expensive, but it's also nearly impossible from a logistics standpoint to be able to do any of this stuff. And so there is an inevitable lag in prices. All right, so if we look down at the graphs here, we have figure 12.4, sticky prices and falling demand. And so if you look at E0 or E0, which is the original equilibrium from the demand line and the supply line, and that is at the top right in the first A graph, it would predict that wages are at W0, and that if you track down, labor is at Q, I don't know if that's a naught or an S, anyway, the Q0. But then, and that is when we are at the production possibilities frontier curve. And then we see a drop in demand. And what happens is that we can't drop wages. And so we can't actually get down to where the demand line 1, the new demand, crosses supply naught, which is just the supply line, the production possibilities frontier for labor. And because that happens, wages stick. And it is, companies are having to overpay for the employees that they have, and so they stop hiring, and then you get a drop-off in employment, and labor moves from Q0 to Q1. Now, basically the same tenets apply to sticky prices in the product market or the goods market. You have demand naught and equilibrium naught, just like in the other one, and the same exact tendencies apply here, except instead of labor, output drops and prices remain the same. And so this is devastating because these products aren't worth that. And your labor isn't worth that, even if you want to look at labor as a product. But nonetheless, prices cannot adjust fast enough, and wages, which is just a price for labor, cannot adjust fast enough. And so you have all of these products now just out there, or all of these people now out there asking this much for their product. I want $10 for my banana, and people are going, wait, your banana's not worth $10 anymore. And so consumption stops. It just basically drops off a cliff. And this is where you get recessions and depressions. And if the government doesn't jump on it really quickly and say, holy crap, we've seen it, we're fixing it right this second, things can get really bad, because then firms just start cutting jobs across the board, people stop buying products across the board, and it starts to build on itself, right? And that can get really scary, as we saw in World War II. Not World War II, excuse me, in the Great Depression. Okay. We should also discuss the expenditure multiplier. So if you look down where the yellow citation is, or the highlighted sentence here, the expenditure model is a nice way of expressing mathematically the idea that there are social benefits or positive externalities from market transactions, okay? And so this is the idea that when you're in the Keynesian period of economics, when your demand hasn't caught up to your supply, your possibility frontier curve, that every dollar you put into the system has major multiplier effects. And so don't let this scare you. It's just a delta is a triangle. The triangle is a delta, and the delta in mathematics just means a change in. So just start thinking of these things more in a language perspective. I find that it helps me if I say a change in Y over a change in spending is greater than 1, right? So as you start spending dollars, you always get a return, at least until when you're in figure 12.7, until you cross from the Keynesian zone into the intermediate zone. You see that? And at that point, we're starting to make this shift from neoclassical Keynesian theory back towards supply-side Say's theory. Okay? But in that intermediate zone, we're pushing back toward getting there to that production possibilities frontier curve, but we may not be quite there, but we need to start thinking about reverting our policies back towards supply side stuff. All right. We should also discuss the Phillips curve, because it is an important discovery in economics, but it is almost meaningless now. So while we will discuss it, it doesn't really apply to modern economics, at least in developed states. It does still apply in developing states, okay? So the Phillips curve is the idea that there is a trade-off between unemployment on one side and inflation on the other, right? Inflation is caused when you're hitting your production possibilities frontier curve, and yet demand increases. There's no way to increase supply, and so it just rides up the price, the x-axis, which is prices. And so you start to get quite bad inflation. Okay? And that's, if you want full employment, inflation is nearly inevitable. Now, on the other hand, if you want to pull down inflation, what you do is reduce employment or increase unemployment. This reduces the aggregate demand in the system and helps to pull down the price level. All right? As we've discussed, however, this doesn't really work anymore. Since the 1970s or so, we've learned so much about economics, and we're so far beyond this trade-off. We're so far beyond inflation ever kicking in at this point, it seems like, though it only has been 50 or 60 years. So I would say, be cautious, but for the last 60 years, inflation is non-existent in developed states, and so there is no trade-off between unemployment and inflation, so the Phillips curve does not work. All right, so it's not something that you need to be worried about, at least under modern economic theory. All right, one last point before I end the chapter. Keynes is not saying that the government should step in and micromanage the economy. That's not what he is saying here. He is saying that the government has a role in guiding macroeconomic policy and aggregate demand in general, right? So, but what he is not saying is that the government should be setting prices or telling individual firms or buyers what to buy or what to make or how much of what to make at what price or any of that stuff. That is microeconomics. We're talking about macroeconomics here, where the government is just giving a nudge, right? If you go back to figure 12.7, under section 12.3 Phillips curve, this is a really nice view of how this works, right? When the government is towards E of K, equilibrium K, on the left side of the graph, you are in a depression. And here, it is in everyone's best interest for the government to be just pumping money into the system to be able to push demand so that we can push demand back up toward the production possibilities frontier curve. All right, so that we can get back to full employment and back to GDP growth and all of these wonderful things that economics can provide. You are spending as you're moving up the curve, spending, and then you hit equilibrium sub I. Okay, and this is where you finally hit the intermediate zone. And so from equilibrium sub I to equilibrium sub N, where we hit the neoclassical zone, at that point we're making the shift from the government pumping money into the system to create demand toward the supply side, where now we want to invest in creating new technologies and ideas and things of this sort so that we can push our production possibilities frontier curve out so that we can have more demand and more growth without causing inflation. All right? It's all starting to come together, right? So that is it. Keynes is not a communist. It is silly to suggest that he is a communist. That is why we differentiate macro and microeconomics. So remember, he's not talking about government planning. He's talking about government nudges to the broader economy, not micromanaging and creating prices and all of this stuff. So don't get Keynes wrong on that front. He is a free market man all the way. All right, that is it. That is chapter 12, and I will get chapter 13 up soon. Have a great day. Bye.